Welcome to Cal Poly Pomona's URP 3350 class, which is Plan Making History in the Future. Today's presentation is from the textbook Urban Land Use Planning by Berke, Godschalk, Kaiser, and Rodriguez. Today we'll look at Chapter 5, which is all about population and the economy. My name is Professor Scott Reimers. So before we get into Chapter 5, we just wanted to take a quick look at Chapter 4 and review what we learned there. That chapter was really divided into two main sections. One was about planning support systems and technologies, and we broke down that into four different categories, from GIS, which stands for Geographic Information Systems, to analytical models, which can be like really, really fancy Excel spreadsheets where you put in population numbers and it gives you what the impacts of those populations might be. In terms of the need for parks or other infrastructure requirements. Then there's the internet. There's a lot of information out there in relation to for data. And then visualization and communication programs. So these are specific programs that are developed by third parties to help the public visualize what growth might look like. Yep. And then the second part of that chapter was about the planning support systems and how they function. And so a good set of planning support systems will describe the history, they'll describe what's going on currently, they'll take a look at what the existing policies are, and then they'll monitor, record, and interpret any changes. So really going from what things look like now to how things will look, how things have changed, and then how things will appear in the future. So they start looking at forecasts. So there you would start to diagnose what planning problems might be coming up in the future. And then they would look at modeling changes, looking at relationships between things, what impacts might be coming. All of that to say that one key aspect that's important to all of this is communicating to decision makers and stakeholders very clearly. So now looking at Chapter 5, this is going to be broken down into three parts. The middle part's really short, so look forward to that. The first part is about how population and economic analyses are used, then sources of data, and then what are some methods for analyzing population. As a means of introduction, I wanted to take a moment to talk about that. Typically what happens is that economic opportunity determines population growth. So communities that are doing well economically are going to attract people into that region. Few people are flocking to Flint, Michigan. It's not a place of great economic opportunity, so population is not tending to grow there. So once you have that economic opportunity and populations coming into that region, that population is then going to determine the size and type of the labor market. So the population starts to come in if that population is very well educated and there's a large degree of them, that's going to provide you a labor market that's going to provide for highly educated workers. That population is also going to determine how much consumer demand is in the area. So if those people are well educated and they have good jobs, then you're going to see a lot of consumer demand. And then, so economists and demographers are going to be your friend in all of this. So few of us planners are going to get into the weeds on these types of things. So as part of your general plan progress or as a specific plan that you're moving forward on, you're going to want to make sure you bring in some economists and demographers to help you with all of this. So really we're just in this chapter providing you a primer on some of these things. We want you to understand the assumptions and implications and theories in these models. And planners need to know what are the pros and cons of all of these different methods. When looking at the important characteristics of population and economy, the authors break it down into three sections: size, composition, and spatial distribution. Size is very simple: how many and how much. How much housing is needed, how many more parks are needed, where do they need, how many more other community facilities are needed, such as libraries, police stations, fire stations, all that sort of stuff. The second one is composition. So of the total population, what is it comprised of or composed of? in terms of population, what's the income, what's the age, what's the education level of the population you have. In terms of economy, what type of employers do you have? Is it mostly industrial? Is it mostly service industry? Just a note, in terms of composition, one key factor is going to be age, because the age of your population is going to drive the community facility needs. So if you have very young population, you're going to need to make sure that you have a lot of parks. If you have an older population, you're going to need to have some good health services. And just to note too that change can occur, that this is not a stable thing, that people age, new people come in, there's migration, people are born, people die, and so throughout all of this, there is change that's occurring. And then lastly is the spatial distribution, and that's just a fancy way of saying how much is it spread out. So you have a population, you have a total, and you have them in these different age groups, but how are they spread out? Are older people in one section? Are younger people in another? Is the entire population in one region of the city and the other sections are not inhabited? So usually your models may need to look at geographic distribution, especially in large cities. Usually determine the amount of need, then you distribute the amount across the city. So first of all, you figure out what's the need of parks, and then you distribute that across the city. Or you determine what the need is for fire service, and then you distribute that across the city. You don't typically project need geographically. And just to note that in Pasadena, we found that household size and age was very different in the Central District than in East Pasadena. So when we were projecting housing increases in the Central District, then we were expecting very different household sizes. We were expecting different age groups to come in. So if we were projecting growth to continue in East Pasadena through more single-family development, then we would have seen very different household sizes and very people of perhaps different ages. So geography in a larger city is going to change your populations and your compositions. Population and economic figures should be able to do 6 different things. They need to describe the existing situation. They need to show you what changes are occurring. They need to be able to help you forecast any future changes. You need to diagnose future planning problems, determine the future demand, and communicate clearly and credibly. So the authors talk about 4 different types of studies. There's studies where you're estimating current population, forecasting, then you have a very specific type, which is a socioeconomic impact assessment, and then you have normative determination of the future population and the economy. So let's get into those different types. So estimating your current population and economy is very important because it helps you understand where you are in comparison to the past. It also helps to compare yourself to other cities around you that people know, or to the county or larger jurisdictions in general. It's important for forecasting purposes, so you need a good first kind of baseline of where you are and where you've been in order to do good forecasting. It's also helpful to understand where you are currently in order to do certain per capita figures. So for instance, service standards in relation to parks are based on the number of acres of parks are based on how many per 1,000 people in the population. So you need to know how many people you're going to have in terms of population, so you can determine how many acres of parkland you need. Also, your current population is going to help you determine funding. A lot of federal funds are based on your current population. So at the federal level, there's the American Community Survey, which is an estimate. It's not a census. That's provided by the Census Bureau. But in California, we also have figures provided by the Department of Finance, and they prepare estimates and prior projections to help us look at the numbers from the past. So that was estimating current population. The next step is then to forecast future population. And so that's important. We need to be able to look at what's going to happen in the future and make some guesses about what those things are and then what infrastructure that needs to be set into place. So one way of doing that is figuring out what the projection is in terms of population growth and determining what the household size is per unit. And that will tell you how many units, how many dwelling units you're going to need for your city. And then from there, you can figure out where you need to put them, how much land it's going to take up. That can be complicated because household sizes are often dependent on the type of unit you're building. So a high density development is going to have a lower number of households or smaller household sizes. Large single family properties are going to have higher numbers of people per household. So it's kind of a complication that you do need to determine household size in order to figure out how many units you need to build. But you also need to know what type of housing you're going to be building to determine the household size. And population size is also important because it helps lead into how much infrastructure you're going to need, so like water or sewer capacity. But also water utilization is also complicated because water utilization depends on the density of that residential land use. So very low density residential land uses require a lot more water per person than very dense housing developments. And that's because there's a lot less landscaping. So the third type of study that the authors talk about is a socioeconomic impact assessment. And that's simply when you look at the impact of a major change to society or an economy. So if you were expecting a large influx of immigrants, then you would want to know that in order to prepare for that. Or if you're seeing like a large aerospace plant closing, you would want to take that into account in terms of planning. And then the last one is a normative determination of the future population and economy. And when you think of normative, think of somebody asking what should happen. And so you're making a decision of what the population growth should be, what's best for the city. This is kind of like what happens with RHNA is that in the RHNA process, the state is giving every city a housing growth goal. And the city's job is to decide where to put that in terms of infrastructure. So let's go over some definitions and distinctions. Sometimes people use these words as synonyms and they're not. They're quite distinct. So let's go through them. The first one is an estimate. I think we all kind of know what estimates are. Estimates from a population and economics perspective are all looking at the past or present levels. This is not a forecast. Estimates are looking at past figures or present figures. Sometimes you'll need to use projections to determine an estimate of today's population. The second is a projection. A projection is the exact measure of a future condition that will occur if assumptions prove true. So in order to develop a projection, an economist or a demographer would put together a certain set of assumptions, and then they would come to an exact figure. And then if that projection isn't met, then they would simply say that the assumptions were not correct. The third is a forecast, and that includes judgments about the likelihood of the assumptions behind the projection. So there is a projection that's given. Typically, it's in a type of range. Forecast has a range. And then the community, throughout these processes, if there's assumptions being made, the community should be brought in on those assumptions so that they're clear about what they are and perhaps even take their opinion on those assumptions. An impact assessment is figuring out what the consequences are of a particular event. And last, the normative determination or design. And that's the idea that planners should not just project and plan for growth, but they should determine how much is best. So the authors provide 4 different perspectives on the future. They say that a community may have different ideas about how to handle growth, and they categorize these into 4 different ways. The first way is my term is the raft, and the notion is that a raft floats on the water and the river takes the raft wherever the river deems is correct. And the analogy I'm trying to create here is that that planners should not affect the growth, they should just plan for it. That the planner should first determine the population and economic needs, and then just plan for sufficient capacity. In the second way, the planners, the second, third, and fourth, the second and third way at the very least, the planner is trying to control growth. And in step number 2, the outsider is, or the planner is seeing that growth is a good thing, that with growth comes some community goods, and that planners should provide for growth and help grow a community. The third is a no growth perspective, and that's that growth comes with negative consequences, that planners should hold back and or slow growth down just so that it's compatible and consistent with that community. And then the fourth is that growth should be sustainable. That growth can be good, it can be bad, but either way, it needs to be led in a direction that it brings community benefits while minimizing harm. Now, just some notes about the difficulties of forecasting. If the time frame is too long, it's going to be very hard to forecast. So typically that's why in California, our general plan guidelines tell us to update your land use plan every 10 years. The idea being it's very hard to project about population and economic needs longer than 10 years. So our plans only last, our plans should be updated every 10 years. And then so the first difficulty is the length of time. The second is the geographic area. So trying to do population projections or estimates in a small geographic area is much harder than a larger geographic area. There are more forecasters working for the country, for entire regions, and there's less at the smaller jurisdictional level. So there's less information for us. And because we're planning and focusing on these small areas, these smaller areas can be very unpredictable. One little change can cause a major disruption. So forecasting population or estimating population over a 10-year time frame for the entire United States, not as difficult as doing a 50-year projection for a small city of like the size of South Pasadena. The authors also highlight different sources of population and economic data. There's really 3 categories. The first is federal agencies. If you're looking for economic data, you're going to go straight to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then if you're looking for more population data, you're going to go to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau, by the way, does have also some economic and employment information. That's the federal level. At the state level, in the state of California, you'll be looking towards the Department of Finance to get that population data. So the Department of Finance does estimates and projections. If you're looking on more the economic side, you're going to be looking at the state level. You're going to be looking at the Employment Development Department, the EDD. There are some other sources beyond the federal and state agencies, and those are things like private companies or regional organizations like the LA Economic Development Corporation, or even your own jurisdictions. For instance, the business license department of your city might have information on the number of employees in each business, or at least the number of businesses, whether they're growing or getting smaller, things like that. So the authors then talk about 5 different approaches to preparing estimates and projections. And the first one is enumeration. And enumeration means you're completely counting everything. And this is what you're doing when you're trying to estimate either past numbers or present numbers. This would be like taking inventory in a grocery store. You're counting every single jar. That's enumeration. The second is more of a sample survey. This is when you have a survey population, but the population is very big. So you just take a sampling of that in order to determine the larger number. So this is what most survey work is like. You can't ask every single person in the population about their opinion on a television show, so you just take a sample of that. And again, this is also used only for past or present, creating past or present estimates. This third is an estimation. This is when you're using indirect indicators to derive a figure. And so this would, for instance, would be using in order to determine population, you'd be using the number of permits issued for new residential construction, and the number of people per household in order to determine population. So again, you're using two different things or one other indicator or symptom in order to create an estimate. The next item is projections. Projections is when you take a model and you use this model to create possible scenarios in the present and in the future. If you're projecting current population based on past census figures, then you're doing a projection. So you're looking at the last 4 or 5 decennial census, and then you just project a straight line growth. That would be a projection. And then the last one is future by design. And that's just when planning the future build out of a community in terms of population rather than projecting based on external forces. So that's when you're just saying, here's the build out number, this is what we're going to set it at, and then that's just a number that's created, rather than saying we're going to base our build out on the future demand. So the authors also then talk about different ways of enumerating, estimating, and projecting. And these are all, by the way, demand side figures. And then we'll talk about the supply side after these. So the first is a judgmental approach. This is when you just create a panel of experts and you ask them. You either survey them or you get them together for a discussion. These could be people from academia. These could be analysts either in the private sector or in the public sector, or they could be business leaders. And usually, if you're going to do a judgmental approach, you're going to combine it with one of these next approaches. The next approach is trend extrapolation. So this is when you look at a trend, and then based on that trend, you look at the future. This should come with a warning, and that warning is past indicators are not a guarantee of future results. So when you're doing extrapolations, what you're looking for is you're going to plot the previous set of figures, and then you're going to use a projection to create future figures. And you're going to see two different lines then. And what you want to do is, in order to determine what's the best way of extrapolating, whether it's linear or exponential or polynomial, you're going to look for which of those three lines are match the line that you have good data on. So we'll show you just on the next slide. The problem with doing trend extrapolation is that you're not adjusting for any new trends. So if you know that a plant is closing in 5 years from now, and a plant hadn't closed in the past 30 years, you're not taking into account that those figures that your population is likely going to drop. So that's the downside of using extrapolation. They're good if you don't have much time, or if you're only doing kind of short projections into the future. So on this slide, we have a number of different ways of doing extrapolations. We have the linear approach, the exponential approach, and the polynomial approach. And so along the white line is the population of Los Angeles County from 1930 to 2020. And you can see that that line in the first, so then we did some linear trend lines, and the linear one just shows that growth is going to remain constant. In your geometric or exponential trend, you're looking at increments of growth increasing at a constant rate. So we're going to keep increasing at a rate of 5% or 3%. The authors talk about a modified exponential, and that's when increments of growth decrease over time at the same rate. And then the last is polynomial, and that's when you allow for certain bends in your trend line. And you can usually in Excel, you can actually put in the number of curves or bends that you want to allow. So in the exponential approach, you can see that the trend line comes way up here. And then in this last polynomial approach, there we allowed for 2 curves in this line. And so what we're looking for is in which case do we have a trend line that most closely matches the actual population line. And in the polynomial approach, we see that these 2 lines are the closest, and so that's most likely going to be the best trend line to follow. And so we would expect in 2030 that the population of LA is going to be closer to around 10.5 million maybe, rather than what we see at the exponential line, which is closer to 16 million or 12 million in terms of linear growth. So we talked about the judgmental approach, we talked about the trend and extrapolation. In the third section, we have ratio and share. In ratio and share, you're really looking at the relationship between a total population and a subgroup, or a parent population and a child population. And you're using that relationship to project or estimate. So you're looking at the percentage of a group in comparison to the total. So for instance, if you wanted to estimate or project the number of people who are foreign born in a population, you could look at the percentage of people who were foreign born in the past. And then if you have a projection of total population into the future, you could just continue that same ratio or proportion. So if foreign born population was 10% of the entire population for the last 50 years, then you might assume that that's going to continue to move forward into the future. And so if you're using the state's projection for your local jurisdiction for the next year, you would just continue forward. Let's say the state's projecting that in 5 years from now, your population is going to grow to 50,000. Then you would say that the foreign-born population is going to be 10% of the 50,000. It's necessary to have a good, reliable projection for the future. In this case, the state's providing you a projection for 5 years out. That needs to be a good, reliable projection. It's important to have a stable ratio. So you'd want to have a stable relationship between the parent group and the child group. And you'd want to have confidence that the study area is going to continue to be consistent in the future, that there's not going to be something unusual coming that's going to increase or decrease that proportion. So the fourth way of enumerating, estimating, or projecting is the symptomatic association. And this is common for estimating, but it should not be used for projections. Basically, you're using a symptom of a larger number to estimate the larger population. So the authors talk about using birth and death rates to estimate population. For instance, the way we determine population in the state of California is we look at household size and building permits to estimate population. And this last section is something that the authors introduce, but really you as a planner do not need to know too much about this. It's very complicated. You should understand just the basics of it, but if you're going to do this type of analysis, you're most likely going to hire an economist or a demographer. And that's using birth rates, death rates, and migration, and even sometimes ethnicity to develop a population projection. And so in the book, there's a series of tables and charts that explain how to do this analysis. And this really should only be used for very large populations. It should not be used for small populations. So again, that's why I'm not going to go into depth here. A few of you are going to be working, for the United States or for the state in terms of coming up with estimates. So that was the demand side forecasting approaches. Now we're going to go over the 3 supply side forecasting approaches. The first is holding capacity, then there's land use and housing modeling, and then forecasting by design. In all 3 of these, the basic process is first you determine how much land you have, then what density you're going to allow on that land, and then lastly, based on that, you can determine what the population is going to be and what your employment forecasts are going to be. The first category, holding capacity approach, that's going to depend on your supply of land, any environmental constraints. So if you have like a large wetland that where you're not going to allow growth, how much density is going to be allowed in that area. Whether you have infrastructure capacity issues, so if you don't have sewer in that area and you're not proposing to put sewer in that area, you're going to have capacity issues. What's the size of the households are going to be? How much employment density is there going to be? All of that's going to go into determining your population. So this is a good way of doing analysis for small areas where your geography is limited. So if you were on an island, if you were a city that doesn't have a larger region around you, this might be a good approach. The second approach after holding capacity approach is the land use housing modeling approach. And this is in California what we do in terms of the regional housing needs assessment, or the RHNA process. So a parent area provides a population down to a sub area, in this case the regional areas like SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, and then SCAG then provides a forecast or a projection of need down to every jurisdiction, the counties and the cities within the SCAG region. And this can also happen vice versa. If you were in charge at a regional government and you needed to know how much infrastructure to plan for or your transit needs, you could then go to each of the member jurisdictions, the smaller jurisdictions, the cities and the counties, figure out what their population projections are, and then from there create a projection for the region. So it can kind of go top down or bottom up. And one thing that that an agency could look at in determining this approach is you could look at proximity to jobs. So if a city's located close to downtown, you might want to project more growth in that area. If it has really good quality schools, or if there's good transit service, you might want to project more growth in those areas. And that's what SCAG does when it's figuring out how to allocate its region, its regional allocation. It looks at some of those factors. And so the last piece after holding capacity and after land use housing modeling is forecasting by design. And that's where you really focusing on a desired rate and location of development. So you might have a specific area left that's going to grow, and then you have set a desired rate. So this would take into account a jurisdiction's ability to provide the services needed for the population. This is actually before Pasadena updated its general plan in 1994. It had a growth management initiative, which said we're only going to allow this number of projects to be built in this city every year. So that's it. We did a summary of Chapter 4. I gave you a run through on Chapter 5, and then just want to take a moment to review what we've learned. We talked about how population and economic analyses are used, and we talked about size. That one of the first important characteristics is just size, how much of something is there. Then there's another important characteristic is composition of that total population. What is it comprised of? What are the smaller components? Another important characteristic is spatial distribution. How is that total population and its components divided across a geography? We also talked about the different types of studies. We talked about estimating current population and the economy, and then forecasting future, so estimating existing, forecasting future, and then socioeconomic impact assessments. That's when like a big employer's leaving, what's that going to do to our city? And then there's normative determinations. Those are things that should happen. And then we talked about some of the difficulties that come about when you're trying to estimate or forecast, especially with forecasting. You don't want to do that for more than 10 years. And that's why in California, we update, or we're supposed to update, our general plans every 10 years. Another difficulty in projecting is when your geographic area is small. A small change could make major changes to the community. Forecasting for larger populations and larger geographic areas, much easier. In terms of sources, this is the short part. There's only three. There's federal agencies, there's state agencies, and then there's some other nonprofits or even your local jurisdiction that might have some good data for you. And then in terms of methods for analyzing population and employment, we talked about enumeration. So that's just counting every single thing. Doing a sample survey sounds like what it is. It's just a survey where you take a sample and try from there to extrapolate that into a larger number. There's estimations where you just estimate based on outside factors. There's projections, which are creating a model to create a whole bunch of different possible scenarios of both the present state and a future state. And so that might be projecting out current population based on past census figures. And then there's future by design, and that's when the planners just figure out what a future build-out number should be in terms of population, rather than projecting it based on external forces. And then we talked about different ways of enumerating, estimating, and projecting. There's the judgmental approach, when you have a bunch of judges give you an opinion. There's the trend extrapolation approach. Those were all those graphs with linear and, oh boy, have I forgotten, linear analysis and polynomial. And then there's ratio share. That's when you're using a change in the larger population to help you figure out what might happen in the smaller population, basing it on a consistent ratio. There's symptomatic associations. So using symptoms of a larger using symptoms in order to find out what a larger change in a population might be. And then techniques that disaggregate and simulate components of population and economy. Those were those really complicated graphs in the book that you don't need to know too much about. And then lastly, we talked about the supply side pieces, and that's the holding capacity approach. That's when you look at how much capacity can the land hold. And then there's the land use housing modeling approach. That's basically what we have in California with the regional housing needs allocation or assessment. And then the forecasting by design. And that's when the planners just sit down and determine based on what's the appropriate rate of growth in a community.